we spoke the other day. And we talked about the October 1922 March on Rome by Mussolini's fascist black shirts, right? An attempt by Mussolini and his supporters to topple the government of Italy. And before that government would be toppled, the king basically gave in. When the Parliament of Italy called for martial law to be declared, the king refused to do that, and in fact he sides with Benito Mussolini and names Benito Mussolini Prime Minister of Italy. But at that point, Mussolini's fascist party is one of a number of relatively small political parties in Italy. So how do they go from being one of a number of smaller political parties in Italy to the one-party totalitarian dictator state that it ultimately becomes? And that's what we're going to talk about today, the consolidation of Mussolini's power. And I think it's important to run through this to kind of lay out a framework that Adolf Hitler will in many ways follow in another decade. This is all happening 10 years before Adolf Hitler comes to power in Germany. So this, in many ways, becomes a template for what Hitler will be doing. November 1922. So this is right after the March on Rome, which is in October. Mussolini, as prime minister, his new government, will receive what's called a vote of confidence from the Italian legislature. And they will approve what are known as emergency powers, like stuff is kind of chaotic right now, so we're going to give ourselves some extra authority while things are so chaotic to reform the governmental administration. A vote of confidence, we often use this kind of figuratively, like to give someone your vote of confidence means I support you. But there can be a literal vote of confidence, like does the legislative body recognize this guy, Benito Mussolini, as their prime minister? They do. He's got now a vote of confidence. In February of 1923, the Nationalist Party in Italy, one of a number of these smaller parties, the Nationalist Party in Italy will join with the Fascist Party. Now, what do you think the Nationalists and the Fascists have in common with each other? What kind of common ground have they long had? Yes, sir, in the back. Okay, maybe they had some issues with the more liberal government. Yeah? They're strong. Obviously, the Nationalist Party, they're nationalists, and the Fascists are fervent nationalists. And what also do they have? How do they share similar foreign policy goals between the nationalists and the fascists? What do they both think Italy should be doing? Yeah, should be a world power, should be an empire builder. They want them to gain more overseas territories. In July of 1923, we're moving along, in July of 1923, the Italian Parliament will pass a law called the Acerbo Law. A-C-E-R-B-O. I will write it if I can find a marker. A-E-C-E-R-B-O. The Acerbo Law, which says that any party in Italy that gets the most votes in an election will receive 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. Sounds legit, right? You get the most votes, you get 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. Well, it's really only legit, though, by our standards, if you get like 2/3 of the votes. But what's happened in Italy is we have a number of smaller parties, and let's say hypothetically you've got a party that's got like 10% of the votes, and a party that's got 15% of the votes, and then a party that's got like 24% of the votes, and a party that's got 25%, and then a party that's got 26% of the votes. All right? What of those 5 parties, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, has the majority of the votes? That's a trick question. Yeah, good. Who said none of them? Look at the big brains on Gavin. None of them have the majority of the votes. Because what is a majority, Gavin? Yeah, having like one more than 50%. And no one does. There's a fancy word that political scientists use for what this party has, but it's not the majority. Anybody know what that would be? Being like the biggest of the minorities? Call that a plurality. They have a plurality of the votes. They don't have a majority of the votes, but they're the largest of all of the smaller minority vote gainers. Well, what this Acerbo Law says is that this party, despite only having 26% of the votes, is going to receive 66%, or 2/3 of the seats in the legislative body. Now, Mussolini wants to do this. The fascists want to pass this. One, because they can get to here. They're never going to get a majority, but they can get to here. And if they can get to here, then they'll have a majority of seats in the legislative body. Mussolini says we need to do this to bring stability to the government. If you don't do this, you've got multiple parties squabbling and no one controls anything. And that can be very difficult. So the Acerbo Law, on its face, is to bring more order and consistency to government. But it's also a way to get the fascist party to dominate. As an example, prior to elections in April of 1924, the fascist party had about 7% of the seats in the legislative body. But after getting a majority of those votes, a plurality of those votes in 1924, in April of 1924, the fascist party will jump up to holding 2/3 of the seats in the legislative branch. All right? So now the fascist party is in control. As a side note, in the next month, a liberal politician named Giacomo Matteotti, don't worry about his name, just hear it. A liberal politician named Giacomo Matteotti speaks out against the fascist violence that had been raging in Italy for the last couple years. Those fascist black shirts, the black shirts that had marched on Rome in October of 1922, many of them are just violent thugs, intimidating people, using political violence to convince them to vote for the fascist party. Well, they get called out by Matteotti, and 11 days later, he's found murdered. And I think people in Italy are starting to gain a sense of what happens when you speak out against this now fascist government. In January of 1925, Benito Mussolini is going to go from Benito Mussolini, fascist prime minister, to Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, the Duke, Il, that's I-L, Il Duce, or his full title, His Excellency Benito Mussolini, head of government, Duke of Fascism. Essentially, giving himself more supreme executive powers in Italy. Yes? Yeah, this is in January of 1925. Proclaiming himself the leader of Italy, the leader of fascism. Il Duce in Italy is to Der Führer in Germany, that we'll talk about in a couple days. And now the ball starts rolling pretty quickly. This is like Mussolini got himself for Christmas of 1925 a totalitarian dictator starter pack. And these are all the things that are going to be included into this. All right? In December of 1925, a law will be passed. Just hear this. Don't need to write it. Called the Law on Powers of Head of Government. The Law on Powers of the Head of Government is passed, which is going to grant, it's going to legislatively grant Benito Mussolini supreme executive authority in Italy, with no one able to check Mussolini's power except for the king. His name is Victor Emmanuel III. No one can check Mussolini's power except for the king. But as long as Mussolini is supremely popular, or at least, and someone asked last class, how popular really was he? Well, here it's difficult to come to these numbers, because the fascists are certainly winning them now a majority of the seats because of the Acerbo Law. So you got a few different categories of people in Italy. You've got those that are absolute supporters of the fascists. They like him. You've got those that say they are supporters of the fascists, so they don't end up like Matteotti, right? There are those that just want to kind of live their lives and be at peace, so they're not speaking out against anything. And all of those together make up a vast majority of the Italian people. And then there's those that might challenge the fascist domination, but they're being struck down by the fascists themselves, all right? So he's got a lot of popular support, or at least those that might oppose him are afraid to speak out against in any great numbers. So he's got a lot of popular support. Well, as long as he has popular support, is the king going to mess with him? No. Because if the king takes out the popular Mussolini, what happens to the king? He might get ousted, right? And is there any precedent for a king in Europe to be ousted when he becomes deeply unpopular with the people? Can anybody think of one or two? Yeah. Yeah, Louis the 16th, right? That kind of started the ball rolling with Louis the 16th having his head removed from his neck, right, at the start of the French Revolution. Or more recently, at the end of World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II from Germany was essentially ousted from power. So this can happen. So in December of 1925, Benito Mussolini starts to unroll all of the factors that we usually see when we hear about a totalitarian dictatorship. Political parties in Italy will be banned. Political parties banned. So any opposition that might come from any liberal party or any socialist party or any communist party or any other party, they're not allowed anymore in Italy. Trade unions will be banned. Trade unions, no more labor unions. The fascists saw divisions of the Italian population as weakness in the Italian population. So if you ban labor, because who is the natural enemy of the labor union? Who? Who are the labor unions like kind of fighting against? Yeah. The companies, the ownership class, right? Well, if you ban labor unions, you can eliminate that conflict, right? At least as it's most visible. The government will take over the Italian press. No free press in Italy. Elected officials will be replaced by appointments by Benito Mussolini. So no more elected officials in Italy. In the next year, in 1926, Italy will develop, or Benito Mussolini will develop a secret police called the OVRA. Italian word, Italian word, Italian word, Italian word. OVRA. It's like the KGB or the Gestapo or something like this, okay? This is the Italian secret police. If you hear your neighbor speaking out against the government and word gets to the OVRA, you might get the knock on your door, all right? Trials will begin to be held without juries. And remember now, who are the judges? Are these elected judges or are these appointed? These are going to be appointed judges by Mussolini's government. So if the government wants you to be found guilty, regardless of the evidence, you can be found guilty now. The death penalty in Italy will be expanded to handle actions against the government authority. A youth movement will be organized, a fascist youth movement, to get young men in Italy in lockstep with the ideology of the fascist party. And everything that we just talked about, guys, will be echoed a decade later in Nazi Germany. This is how you put together a fascist state. All right? So while many are very nervous about, I think there's some, I hope they're going too far, there's some that are very nervous about this presidential election and where we might be going if there's election. If we after a presidential election, if you start hearing of people like challenging like the free press or starting some kind of Hillary Clinton youth movement or Donald Trumpian youth movement, I'm being politically correct. I'm including both in there. We would get nervous because these things have happened in history before. Anyhow, there are limits to the totalitarian rule in Italy. Benito Mussolini's totalitarianism is not going to be quite as complete as Adolf Hitler's will be a decade later. As I already said, the king can take Mussolini out of power. Doesn't mean he will, but he can. So there's one check on Mussolini's power. And also Mussolini has a relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. The Vatican, Mussolini talks to the Vatican and in ways has to answer to the Vatican. Remember, most Italians are Catholic. The Vatican previously had a poor relationship with the Italian government. Now it's better under the fascists. But Mussolini needs that support from the Catholic Church. If the Catholic Church turns on Mussolini, what would many Catholics possibly do? Turn on Mussolini. So he's not as totalitarian as we'll see later with Adolf Hitler, but he's about as far as we've seen in Europe to this point. Okay? So what are Mussolini's goals? Foreign policy-wise, we're going to take a look at a map of Europe here. Foreign policy-wise, Adolf Hitler wants to increase Italian national pride. All of those divisions that had existed in Italy between north and south and wealthy and poor, he wants to bring those people together. And he wants to grow that Italian national pride by revising the post-war settlements at the end of World War I that he feels didn't give Italy what they were owed based on what they were originally promised. He wants to dominate the Balkan region. Guys, this is the Balkan region. The Balkan Peninsula is this southeastern portion of Europe. The Balkan Peninsula. Not to be confused with the Baltic region. That's in the north. Baltic Sea, the Baltic states. This is the Balkans. He wants to dominate the Balkans. He wants to dominate the Mediterranean Sea. Anybody know what the Romans used to call the Mediterranean Sea when they used to dominate the area? They didn't call it the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean just means like between two lands, like Middle Earth, like right, Hobbit land, between Europe and Africa. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Ooh, it's pretty bold, right? But they literally like controlled all of the territory around the Mediterranean Sea. Well, Benito Mussolini wants to bring that back again. So he wants to dominate the Mediterranean. He wants to dominate the Balkans. He wants to build an empire so he can gain what is called in Italian spazio vitale, living space. Now, you guys have probably heard of living space from the German perspective, Lebensraum, where we talked about the Japanese desiring resources and space for the growing Japanese population. So this living space for the Italian people is a common theme that we see. And he wants to do much of this in Africa. Africa, directly across the Mediterranean. He sees that being the place where Italy can expand. To do this, he needs to grow the Italian economy. All of that, although those plans are going to take money, he needs to grow the Italian economy. And among many plans that he has, the one I want you to kind of hear about today is the development of what is known as the corporatist state, or Italian corporatism. Like a corporation? Corporatism. Corporatism in Italy. Well, before I go there, let me just kind of refresh your memories as to what other kinds of isms, economic isms, we have in the early 20th century. There's capitalism, right? Capitalism, where the goods of production, the means of production of society, the factories, the resources, they're owned by private individuals. And private individuals can do with them as they see fit. All right? That's capitalism. Communism says that capitalism doesn't work because then you end up with a very wealthy few and an oppressed majority. And so a better system is a communist state where the public, where everybody owns the means of production of society, where there is no private ownership of land or of resources, and those resources are shared amongst the populace. All right? Corporatism kind of takes some leanings from both sides. A corporatist state says there will be private corporations, private industry, but they will be strictly regulated by the government because it is the government, it is the state that is important above all. Like in the United States, an American corporation, kind of like General Motors, for example, or Ford, they have to answer first to their shareholders. They're a profit-driven company. And today, I don't think many people would delude themselves to think that even though maybe they have the base of their operations in the United States, that they are an America-first company. Like they'll put American flags on their commercials and pickup trucks driving through doing rugged American-y things. But their first responsibility is to their shareholders, right? their bottom line. And if they're not turning a profit, no matter how patriotic they are, what happens to the company? It ceases to exist, right? So they've got to answer to shareholders first. In the corporatist state, it is the state above the corporation. It is the state above corporate profits, all right? And this goes both ways, too. What did the fascists do to the trade unions that might rival with business owners? What did they do to trade unions? They banned them. And the idea is everybody, workers and owners alike, work towards the good of the state. Yes? Socialism was absolutely a thing. Every party, Benito Mussolini, before he was a fascist, was a leading socialist in Italy. But he split with the socialists on his support for World War I. So absolutely, socialism is a thing. Socialism just says that, again, the means of production of society should be more so government-controlled, government-owned. Not necessarily, like where communism typically takes it to a further extreme is there should be no private ownership, no private property. Today, countries like Sweden that are like heavily socialistic still have a lot of private ownership of industry and property. But the government has much more control over many aspects of those societies. Anyway, this corporate state, this push towards a corporate state, and other economic reforms of Benito Mussolini, they don't drive Italy into being an economic powerhouse, okay? They largely fail to put Italy on the economic footing that he had hoped. But then he's kind of up against it. Like, what else is going to be happening as we get to the late 1920s to hamper any kind of economic advancements Italy might otherwise be making? We got a Great Depression that's going to begin. All right. So anyway, Italy is going to be making some reforms. Mussolini is going to make some reforms to try to put the country on good economic footing so they can be this, like, powerful, great power of Europe, expansionist, imperialistic state. Let's talk about how they're ultimately going to do that. In 1923, Italy wanting to dominate the Balkans. And remember, the Balkans, this southeastern Europe, this peninsula, Balkan Peninsula here. Italy wanting to dominate the Balkans makes its first very subtle move on a Greek island called Corfu. C-O-R-F-U. An Italian official was killed in Greece. And as retribution, Benito Mussolini will send an army to seize the Greek island of Corfu. This is in 1923. Now the League of Nations will condemn this action, because that's what the League of Nations does best, is condemn things. But in this case, Britain, having deep interests in Greece, Britain says, whoa, 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 Italy, you've got to back out of there, because we've got like the biggest navy in the world and we're not afraid to use it. Now, this is very different from the story of 1931 Manchuria, right? 1931 Manchuria, there's a Great Depression going on. Britain is not going to use its navy to defend Manchurians. They don't see it in their interest. But Corfu, 1923, Italy comparatively weak compared to what Japan would be a decade later. Benito Mussolini recognizes he's not ready to fight. Italy just got out of World War I. They're broke as a joke. He's got a new government he's putting together. This is not the time for a fight. And he does back down. But in the next year, Italian troops will seize the Yugoslavian port city of Fiume. F-I-U-M-E. This was a disputed port. According to Italy, and according to that Treaty of London that got Italy into World War I, Italy was supposed to receive this port. But instead it was granted to the new nation of Yugoslavia upon its creation in 1924. Or upon Yugoslavia's creation after World War I. In 1924, Italy will seize this port. Yes?
Just one more time.
Fiume, F-I-U-M-E. Italy will seize this port. Now, they're not made to back away from this one. It's not as much in the interests of the other powers of Europe. But France is nervous. France is nervous. And I'm going to talk about French interest in the region for just a moment. This, again, is Europe after World War I. And you guys, don't write this down, just listen here. After World War I, was France happy or kind of bummed out about the Treaty of Versailles? Yeah, Gavin. Very good. They didn't think it was strong enough. They wanted Germany to be like literally broken apart, and they didn't get what they wanted. So after the war, France starts to get in good with some of these new nations in Eastern Europe, like Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Yugoslavia and Poland. France wants good relationships with those countries. Because if the stuff ever hit the fan with Germany again, France needs allies over here that could force Germany to split that army in two. And they can't rely on Russia anymore because Russia is now Communist Soviet Union. And France has got its own communism threat in its own country. So France started pumping money into what became known as the Little Entente. Le Petit Entente, probably, right? Is that right, Patricia? You say it better than me, though. Say it. The Little Entente. Oh, it sounds much better from you. Okay, so the Little Entente, where France would be pumping aid into countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia to keep them strong and to keep Eastern Europe, keep a rival to Germany in Eastern Europe. All right, Czechoslovakia will be much more important later, and if you even look at Czechoslovakia, it looks like a dagger into the heart of Germany. That will be a part of our story going forward. So France has got interests in Eastern Europe, but now Italy is trying to take a more assertive role in Eastern Europe. Italy, in 1924, in addition to taking that port city of Fiume, will sign a treaty of friendship with the nation of Albania. And they will make Albania a protectorate of Italy. Italy is going to have Albania's back. Now, a little side note to this story, guys. Don't write this down. This is just tracing back into history a little bit. Why is Albania reaching out for Italian help? If you notice, Albania is kind of almost surrounded by Yugoslavia. And there's a lot of Serbs in Yugoslavia that resent the very existence of Albania. Albania was created before World War I, carved out of territory along the Adriatic here from old Ottoman lands. And certainly there were Albanians that lived in there. Serbia didn't want Albania to ever exist because Albania's existence blocked Serbia from getting on the coast. So Serbs and Albanians have long had a rivalry, and it's continuing now. Well, Italy is jumping onto Team Albania. Italy says, I got your back, Albania. Not because they have any deep love for Albanians, but what do they want to do? Dominate the Balkans, all right? Dominate the Balkans, and Albania is like a step towards Balkan domination. This upsets France, because France is trying to dominate the Balkans as well, in Europe. And Italy and France are also butting heads in North Africa. Italy and Mussolini want their spazio vitale in North Africa, but France has already got North Africa largely on lockdown. Tunisia is French. Algeria is French. Morocco is French. And Italy wants in on that. So we've got a pretty deep rivalry growing between Italy and France. We will come back after lunch and wrap this thing up.